I'm delighted to introduce this panel on sexuality and bodies. My name is Theo Gordon and I'm a postdoc here at the Courtauld in the Research Forum. And our first speaker is Andrew Cummings. And Andrew is a collaborative doctoral candidate at the Courtauld Institute of Art and at Tate's Asia Research Centre. His doctoral project explores storytelling and queer world-making in contemporary video and performance art from East and Southeast Asia. Specifically, it combines Anglo-American queer theory with research on queer Asia to understand what is at stake for queer and marginalized people in the region when the distinction between fantasy and the real is blurred. And Andrew's paper is titled Apocalypse Now.
Thank you, Theo. Also, thanks to Eddie for organising such an amazing conference, and thanks to everyone else who spoke today so far as well. Can everyone hear me okay? I don't know if I'm a bit too tall for this microphone. Okay, thank you. At the Pride Parade in Seoul, one protester ardently holds up a placard that reads, 피땀 흘려 세운 나라 동성애로 무너진다. Same-sex love spells the collapse of the nation. Meanwhile, over on Ilbe, the country's prime right-wing forum, one user lists their legitimate reasons to oppose same-sex love, observing that queer people, and in particular people who engage in anal sex, are, and I quote, a zombie force that is driving the nation to ruin, and an evolutionary anomaly that disrupts the order of humanity. For the socially conservative, non-normative expressions of sexuality and gender threaten to unravel the fabric of the social order. No wonder then that queer people have often found themselves described in apocalyptic terms, like in the examples I just gave. Less than human beings with depraved desires, which tease apart the threads of civilization as we know it. And if these beings are left to flourish, risk shredding it apart completely. Conversely, apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic scenarios have been embraced as a means for envisaging a world in which queer people can thrive. In the collection of works that I'm going to talk about today by South Korean artist Ju Kim and exhibited under the title Succulent Humans in a small art space in Seoul in March last year, the end of life on Earth and the accompanying breakdown of the social and ecological orders become an occasion for imagining social relations beyond fixed categories of biology, gender, and desire. As Kim knows, we're living in a time in which the threat of the extinction of much or all of life on Earth seems increasingly inevitable and imminent. Even in the 18 months since Succulent Humans was displayed, there's been a dramatic upturn in the momentum of mainstream environmental movements, both in South Korea and here in the UK. In the narrative Kim writes, which draws the exhibition's works together, environmental catastrophe and the accompanying breakdown of social life form the very foundation upon which a queerer world can be built, a world not predicated on fixed and highly stratified categories of gender, sex, or desire. So Succulent Humans tells the story of the last surviving humans as they embark on a spaceship and leave the Earth, which will soon be destroyed in a, quote, ecological apocalypse. The gallery walls show us an alien topography, the now barren, snow-dappled surface of a planet, presumably the Earth, set against an eerily pink sky. Hovering in the sky, you can see, is an anus, the vehicle which will carry the survivors away from the decaying Earth. The surviving humans' reproductive organs are now useless, we're told. Unable to reproduce as before, they're eventually able to use the rib of Adam from the Old Testament story to grow new human beings, so-called succulent humans. Succulents that seem to be growing from ribs are nestled in glass planters, suspended from the gallery ceiling using translucent nets. Succulents also sprout from other sculptures in the installation, including a human hand. So I want to begin with the rear end, the image of the anus that depicts the survivor's spaceship. This image has a history in Kim's work. It appeared in his 2017 installation, The Peach Blossom Land. The title of that installation is taken from a 5th century Chinese fable, well known in Korea as Murungdohwan, about a man who squeezes through an orifice in a cave surrounded by peach trees and discovers a thriving community living in harmony on the other side. Teasing out the peach's historical connections with paradise in Korean history and its more recent associations with buttocks via the peach emoji, Kim's exhibition, The Peach Blossom Land, playfully examines the subversive and utopian potential accorded to the anus by the Spanish philosopher Paul Preciado, whose work Kim recommends as further reading in his description of that exhibition. I take the upcycling of this anus in Succulent Humans as an invitation to use Preciado's work to think through Succulent Humans too. In particular, what Preciado has called an anal or countersexual politics in his writing over the last decade or so, especially in his essay Anal Terror and his countersexual manifesto. To summarize Preciado's thoughts very briefly, he posits sexuality as a technology or a machinery which, and I quote, prescribes the context in which the organs acquire their meaning and are properly used in accordance with their nature. In the Western context, Preciado describes, natural sexuality is reproductive and therefore heterosexual, and so the sex organs are reproductive organs, the penis and the vagina, organized into a hierarchy. By the same token, other organs are understood as non-sexual, and erotic practices involving these organs, in particular the anus, are deviant or abject. By way of Deleuze and Guattari, Hockingham and Foucault, Preciado draws upon a Western history of sexuality shaped by particular psychoanalytic, medical, and juridical discourses, among others. In South Korea, which is the main context that Kim works in response to, reproductive sexuality is also naturalized, albeit for different reasons. Very briefly, among these reasons, scholars have included Neo-Confucianism, the ideology of the Joseon dynasty for 500 years until Japanese colonization at the turn of the 20th century, and an ideology which emphasizes a healthy, heterosexual, and patriarchal family as the basic building block for society. A more contemporary influence would be Christianity, specifically Protestantism, which has flourished over the 20th and 21st centuries in Korea. The effects of these influences can be seen today in, for example, the law banning anal sex between members of the military, regardless of consent, and 2 years of military service remains compulsory for men between the ages of 18 and 28 in Korea. Or it can be seen in the droves of protesters, many of them religious, who turn out to disrupt the Pride Parade in Seoul each year. Preciado looks to language as a reflection of the primacy of reproductive heterosexuality, and so can we. Uri Malsem, the largest Korean language dictionary, defines the penis, or umkyong, as the male's external reproductive organ, while the vagina, or til, is the female's reproductive passageway that receives the penis during intercourse and becomes the route by which the child emerges during birth. Business as usual. The vagina is merely a receptacle for the comings and goings of the penis and the child being born. Preciado's assertion is that prevailing understandings of gender, sex, and sexuality, like many of the objects in Kim's exhibition, are plastic. That is, they're artificial, but also malleable. They're also prosthetic, he says. Again, artificial or constructed, but also organic, an extension of the body. Through what he has called an anal politics, Preciado invites us to estrange ourselves from predominant topographies of the body and its desires, to recognize these topographies as plastic and prosthetic, and to invent other prostheses or sexual technologies. Practicing anal politics means reclaiming as sexual any organ, organic or inorganic, that has the capacity to channel the potentia gaudendi, or orgasmic force, through a nervous system connecting a living body to its exteriority. Anal politics means acknowledging the body's porousness, that is, its openness to penetration and sensual pleasure by means of various erogenous zones beyond reproductive organs. The anus is especially useful for Preciado because it escapes the rhetoric of sexual difference. Every body has one. Beyond this, sexual practices involving the anus allow for fluid and reversible sexual roles. Anyone, regardless of their genitalia, can be a penetrator and a receptor. In short, the goal of an anal politics is the end of the social order predicated on phallocentrism. Or, as I referred to it the other day in conversation with some colleagues, the dickpocalypse. In a knowing wink to Preciado, in succulent humans, the anus is literally the vehicle for a community whose relations are not predicated primarily on heterosexual reproduction, nor therefore on fixed and striated categories for gender, sex, and desire. The anus may represent the end of one kind of social order, but it is the beginning of another one. In the scenario that the exhibition imagines, the last surviving human's reproductive organs, their natural sex organs, no longer function as such, and so the discursive scaffolding that designates these as primary or only zones for pleasure is weakened. The exhibition is scattered with references to sexually non-reproductive practices. For example, there's this transparent sheet embroidered with silicone tubes and suspended from chains, not dissimilar to the slings associated with BDSM practices which, as Preciado has written, expose the erotic power structures underlying the contract that heterosexuality has imposed as natural. A clear studded fisting glove hangs from one of the chains, while over another chain hangs a viscous glob of semen, wasted in reproductive terms. Like Preciado's elaboration of anal politics in essays like Anal Terror and his Countersexual Manifesto, Succulent Humans is at once playful and deadly serious. Take the sling and another hanging as an example. They look like tapestries depicting objects of worship and adoration for the surviving humans, and seem almost religious or ritualistic. But they're emblazoned with profane images that are resonant of transnational, interregional, queer, popular, and media cultures in East Asia. These images depict queer-coded characters from Japanese anime, popular among queer viewers in South Korea since the 90s. So in the center, you can see Sailor Uranus from Sailor Moon, who's kissing Sailor Moon. And on the right, Kaworu Nagisa, with the sort of purpley silvery hair, from the post-apocalyptic series Evangelion, and he's also become the protagonist of many slash-fiction comics in the boys' love genre, which are stories of romance between men, mostly written by women, for women, and which have circulated in East Asia, principally in Japan, since the end of the 20th century. But unlike in Kim's earlier work, The Peach Blossom Land, as well as Preciado's writing, in Succulent Humans, the idea of an anal utopia, foregrounding the porousness and plasticity of the body, is here brought into the realm of ecology. The exhibition highlights that the human body is porous, not only in terms of its openness to penetration through multiple zones of pleasure, but also vis-à-vis the so-called natural environment, which is exterior to and supposedly separate from the body. And although Succulent Humans seems to revel in environmental collapse, it nonetheless has something to offer us as we move forward into an uncertain ecological and social future. Although the reasons for the ecological apocalypse in Succulent Humans are not divulged, the exhibition's orgy of non-biodegradable synthetic materials suggests that the catastrophe is of human provenance. The proliferation and saturation of plastic and silicon here trigger anxieties about the unbridled consumption and disposal of indecomposable materials in the Anthropocene, anxieties which today seem more heightened than ever. The landmass that you can see here is composed of sedimented layers of garish polyurethane foam, and pink sand spews out of its side, carrying a slew of plastic corpses with it, a perverse twist on the flood narrative from the book of Genesis. Plastic is already merging with what's often called the natural world. In the ocean, for example, plastics host microbial communities and develop their own ecologies, or plastospheres, as they've been called. The landmass here offers a means of contemplating a future in which the quote-unquote natural world has been consumed by synthetic materials entirely. Amidst calls for plastic consumption to be curbed in South Korea as in the UK, Succulent Humans rejoices in the ubiquity and toxicity of plastic, including its effects on the human body. Plastic, we know, is one of the chemical waste products dumped into ecosystems that in turn is altering the body's ability to produce hormones such as estrogen. In the likely event that this pollution continues, the human capacity for so-called natural reproduction could be jeopardized. In the narrative of Succulent Humans, we're not told why the reproductive organs of the last surviving humans have failed, But looking over the spongy synthetic landmass and the plastic toys that represent the survivors, it's difficult not to conclude that it might have something to do with the effects of plastic's toxicity on the human body, which, far from being sovereign over and separate from its environment, is intimately connected to it. As Mel Chen writes, our bodies are being queered by environmental toxicity, whether we like it or not. Succulent Humans exults in the possibilities that this situation offers us, possibilities for existing beyond inflexible categories of gender, sex, desire, and even the human. It's not by chance that Kim's choice of materials also evokes affects and practices typically associated with queer pop culture, recalling a taste for the tacky and artificial, as well as with the prosthetic more broadly, from dildos to butt plugs. Now, all of this is not to say that the future composite should be embraced unequivocally, nor that we should do nothing to curtail the impending apocalypse. Under the current conditions of toxicity and pollution, privileged white inhabitants of the global north remain the least affected. The works in Succulent Humans picture humanity at the moment of its escape and transformation, and in so doing, they don't attend to the painful reality of the slow violence of ecological destruction that many of the Earth's species and humans are already facing. But Succulent Humans does have something to teach us, I think, in its acknowledgement of the porosity or porousness of the human body and its celebration of the body's vulnerability to alteration by toxins. On one level, a great deal of climate change activism continues to appeal to the assumption of continued heterosexual reproduction as the norm. We need to protect the world for the sake of our children and their children, and so on. Succulent Humans foregrounds the fact that our future and our present are queerer than this vision would let on. I'd like to conclude by reflecting on a relevant quote by Mel Chen again, who reminds us that mainstream environmentalism tends to frame toxicity as an unnaturally external force that violates rather than informs an integral and bounded self, and is symptomatic of the abandonment of humans' integral relation to their environments and the insistence of a radical segregation of self and world fueled by a bellicose antagonism. It's arguably the assumption that the body is bounded off from its environment that has permitted the pollution of the environment on a grand scale in the first place. By offering a vision of the world in which the plastics in the environment have altered our bodies completely, then, Succulent Humans disavows this segregation. To return to a similar idea to the one I started with, a greater tolerance of toxicity, that which is assumed to be external to or different from oneself, might go hand in hand with an acceptance of those who are themselves often thought of as antithetical to society, as toxic to it, or those who might bring about its doom. It might also, as Kim's exhibition suggests, bolster us against this doom, or perhaps carry us beyond it, by moving beyond fatalistic, apocalyptic narratives of us versus them. Fags might doom nations, but perhaps they can save the world. Thank you.